Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. Please join me and my guests on this next interview. Now, Donald Trump's first week back in office has already signaled key shifts in U.S. foreign policy, leaving European leaders to navigate an uncertain transatlantic relationship. Some are eager to build ties, while others take a more cautious or even confrontational approach. The early weeks of Trump's presidency will be crucial in shaping global dynamics, particularly for NATO, U.S. EU relations, and response to Russia and China. What can we expect in the months ahead? Joining us today on TVP World to discuss is Scott Lucas, professor at University College Dublin. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks to you and all your great viewers.
So it's only been a week, and Trump has already set a new tone for the U.S. policy going forward. So what are some of the most, what stands out most so far when it comes to foreign policy, in your opinion?
The chaos. There haven't been specific changes of policy yet, let's say on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So Trump talks about how he would have brought peace within 24 hours. Of course, that didn't occur. We're still trying to consider what plans are being put forth by his close advisors like Keith Kellogg, Mike Waltz. But it looks like, we're talking about an approach in which, if the advisors have their way, then you're going to try to get negotiations, but negotiations from strength. In other words, U.S. military aid to Ukraine will continue while the Zelensky government accepts that Russia will occupy part of Ukraine for the near future. In the Middle East, we don't know what might happen next because we're in the middle of that first phase of the Israel-Gaza ceasefire, and it will only be next month where we find out if there's going to be a phase two and what role the Trump administration will play if there is or isn't one. But when you talk about the broad sweep of American foreign policy, it is part of the disruption of government. For example, the Trump administration has frozen or tried to freeze all foreign aid programs except to Israel and Egypt. Now, although publicly they pulled back on this in name, in practice, those aid programs are frozen, and that includes aid for healthcare, it includes aid for food security, it includes humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And that was simply because Trump put in a right-wing activist involved in the January 6th Capitol attack who decided to try to gut the agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development. If you talk about the Department of Defense, there is an utterly unqualified new defense secretary, a TV commentator named Pete Hegseth, who is pledging to get rid of generals, commanders, and admirals who are woke. You can talk about the ban on anyone even identifying as transgender, let alone participating as a transgender person, which has already affected enrollment in the U.S. military. You have had a large number of State Department officials who have been purged, forced out, a large number of members of the Justice Department who have been forced out. In other words, we're not seeing a specific effect on a specific policy yet, but we're seeing a real question about whether the U.S. government will be able to function overseas because Trump is carrying out a policy of retribution.
All right, well, if said chaos is to take place, like you mentioned, how are European leaders trying to adapt to this kind of more dynamic situation? Are they prepared to take it head on? Are there some patterns that we can observe?
Well, I think at the level of issues, there are specific preparations going underway. So let's talk about tariffs. We're only beginning to get the first shots from Trump over tariffs. 25% on Canada, 25% on Mexico, 10% on China, but he has threatened the European Union with tariffs, as you just mentioned a few moments ago. And European leaders have to talk about what they're going to do with their economies to try to protect them and how they're going to try to work with each other in terms of trade amongst each other, but also trade with other countries except the United States. Then if you talk about the broader levels, such as security, you have an approach where I think most European leaders will flatter Trump. Most European leaders will not confront Trump because they know that he starts and ends his foreign policy with whether he looks good. He's a transactional leader. So you don't want to upset him because then he gets even more chaotic. But at the same time, you have to get to advisors around Trump to try to limit any damaging moves he is making. So European leaders behind the scenes will be talking about bolstering the European Union, and they will be talking about bolstering NATO. And then you will see some leaders that will come out and say that we do face the threat of Trump without directly insulting him. A leader like the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk will say, yes, this is a challenging time. It is an urgent time for us to make preparations and to reach out to allies around the world rather than just simply following what Washington does.
All right, the Polish Prime Minister actually has came out and say that they are ready for all scenarios when it comes to tariffs in particular. How do you think that Poland is preparing to deal with such situation? And as you alluded to earlier, perhaps not straight out coming out and insulting Donald Trump, but perhaps play a more adversarial role?
Well, the immediate thing that Poland, as well as other countries, will be doing will be to try to forestall those tariffs. So there'll be a lot of lobbying inside Washington, both as Poland, but also as members of the EU, not directly of Donald Trump, but of others in the Trump administration to say, really, you want a trade war? No one benefits from this. Then, because Trump might go ahead anyway, what you do is you have to look at your agricultural sector. You have to look at your manufacturing sector, and you have to say, how can we support the sectors that will be affected because of a U.S. duty on Polish imports? How can we try to look for new other trade opportunities for these sectors? And do we consider retaliation against the United States? But I think that retaliation against U.S. imports into Poland, because as I said, no one wins in a trade war, that's something that probably won't happen at the national level. You'll be having Poland talk to EU partners, saying, do you want EU retaliation in a very limited way against American products if Trump goes ahead with a tariff of, say, 10, 15, 25%?
Right, we've repeatedly seen Trump using tariffs as sort of a leverage to get his negotiation goals passed, be it the situation in Colombia, or we're looking at China, we're looking at Canada and Mexico at the moment. He was citing issues with fentanyl. What would be his request, or what would he be trying to achieve if he does indeed trying to put tariff on the European Union?
The broad thing that he tries to do with the tariffs is he's a bully. He was a bully as a businessman. He's a bully as president. And what he tries to do is for you to enter negotiations with him from a position of weakness, almost bowing down to him. We saw this with Mexico and Canada during Trump's first term. They resisted, by the way. And in fact, the revised U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was not a bad agreement for all three countries. If you have Trump threatening the EU, including Poland, what you have to do is say, look, we're ready to negotiate with you on our trade relationship, but we're not going to do it from the standpoint of giving you everything you're asking for, because your demands are probably unjust. The U.S. and the EU have a very healthy trading relationship. The U.S. is one of the EU's top trading partners, both in terms of imports and exports, and vice versa for Washington. So I think, again, this is that necessity of coordinating amongst yourselves, that if the EU is going to have to go into trade talks with the American administration, they do so as a unified bloc. You don't have Poland doing one thing, you don't have France doing one thing, Ireland doing another thing, or someone, for example, like Viktor Orban, who is a threat within the EU, breaking away and trying to appease Trump on his own.
All right, well, a lot of people have the theory that Trump usually starts his negotiations from all the way up there and then have it kind of negotiated down, like you mentioned earlier in his previous administration, where U.S., Canada, Mexico was able to come to an agreement that is actually not so bad. Do you think that this might be what is going to happen here in the European Union, where perhaps Trump again makes more outrageous requests and then potentially letting himself be negotiated down to something more acceptable?
I don't think the biggest threat is Trump here, because I got to say this again, and it's bizarre because of Trump's image as a successful businessman, when in fact he's had 6 bankruptcies, but he doesn't focus. He can't focus on an issue over a sustained period of time. So you simply just keep on, appeasing him, talking to him, say, yes, of course we'll talk. And then he loses interest and he looks at someone else. The problem are those people around Trump who may have a grievance against the European Union. in the first term, there were people in the Trump administration, such as Steve Bannon, such as Peter Navarro, who wanted to break up the European Union. That's partly why they encouraged Brexit and to get the UK out of the EU. This time around, there are still voices, quite loud voices, both inside the administration or close to it, who do want to break up the European Union. That includes, again, Peter Navarro, who is still an influence despite having gone to prison. It includes within the administration, I think, the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. So those are the people you kind of watch. At this point, you don't even have a clear line in terms of the U.S. trade representative and where they're going next. So I think while Trump grabs the headlines, the real question is, those behind him in the administration, do they have a plan? Do they have a plan in terms of how they approach the EU? And again, that's what European governments, embassies, European departments of foreign affairs will be assessing right now behind the scenes.
Right, and going back to what you mentioned earlier, we talked about NATO as well, and of course we're all wondering what's the future for this military alliance. Do you think that Trump's return threatens NATO unity, or do you think this could actually push Europe towards a greater self-reliance when it comes to bolstering its defense?
I think with certain exceptions. Hungary's Viktor Orban, Slovakia's Robert Fico, who, let's be honest, are closer to the Kremlin than they are necessarily to NATO. I think the rest of Europe and others like Canada will be drawn together. I think what is interesting is that Trump will claim credit for that increase in defense spending by NATO allies, many of them now reaching the 2% target. That's not completely true, but I do think that NATO members have been increasing spending on defense because of the threat of Donald Trump, that they cannot just sit back and watch the U.S. walk away. So I think in terms of not only spending, but probably more importantly, in terms of how you organize yourselves, in terms of defense and security, in terms of the logistics, in terms of the weapons, in terms of the balance between air, naval power, and ground operations, in terms of confronting hybrid warfare, you're seeing a lot more intense activity amongst the other 31 members of NATO, who, remember, include countries that were not there at the start of Trump's first term, include countries like Sweden and Finland. The reality is that Donald Trump thinks about Donald Trump himself first. Many NATO countries, because of the proximity of the Russian threat, including Poland, have to think not about Donald Trump first. They have to think about their own security. So yes, I don't think NATO can match the amount of resource it has right now if the U.S. steps aside. But I do think NATO can come together as a much more effective organization in terms of its planning and operations if this Trump threat continues.
All right. Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your input, and really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thanks to all of you.
Cheers. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.